Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. This event at the Wilson Center, recapping President Biden's trip to Europe. There was a cascade of summits with the president, and we're really pleased to have senior members of the National Security Council staff here with us to discuss all of that, what went on, and how we should understand what was achieved. My name is Dan Hamilton. I direct the Global Europe program at the Woodrow Center. And this is a cooperative venture with many of my colleagues today. I'm just here to welcome you and to tell you how you also can participate. This is a public event. If you have a comment or a question as we go into the program, you can send us an email at GEP, Global Europe Program, at wilsoncenter.org. That's GEP at wilsoncenter.org. Or send us a tweet at Wilson Center GEP. Send us a tweet at Wilson Center GEP. That's how you send it to us, and we'll weave that into the conversation. And the person who will do that is my colleague Abraham Denmark, who directs the Asia program at the Wilson Center, who's going to moderate today. So I'm going to turn it over to Abe to get us going. Abe, please.
Thank you, Dan, and thank you everybody for joining us this afternoon. Welcome to the Wilson Center. We are very excited about the program that we have today. I'll provide a little bit of an outline of what we're going to do and then introduce our guests. We're going to have introductory remarks from three members of the Biden administration National Security Council staff, which will be followed by brief discussions of the three with three of my colleagues from the Wilson Center, at which point we will open things up for discussion. As Dan mentioned, you can send questions in over email or over Twitter. Joining us today is Dalip Singh, who's Deputy National Security Advisor and also serves as Deputy Director of the National Economic Council. We also have Amanda Sloat, Special Assistant to the President and Senior Director for Europe at the National Security Council, and Laura Rosenberger, who's a Senior Director for China and Taiwan at the National Security Council. So now we will turn things over to Dalip to get things going. Please go ahead.
Yeah, so thanks Abe, and thanks Dan. Let me just say a few things about the G7. So going into the summit, our objective was very clear. We wanted to show that America is back at the table, mobilizing the major democracies of the world around a shared purpose. And that purpose is to demonstrate that our democratic values, our way of life, remains the single best path to deliver results for our people and for people around the world. And I think on that measure, we should feel encouraged by what happened at the G7. Sitting in the room with leaders, I saw a genuine desire to come together with actions, substantive actions that mean something in people's lives. So let me explain in more detail. First and foremost, G7 leaders knew we had to step up and lead the world out of the pandemic. And so the G7 pledged over 1 billion vaccines for delivery over the next year, including 500 million vaccines from the US alone, to the lowest income countries in the world. And this donation was made without conditions, without any strings attached, and with a clear signal that this is not the end of the effort by any stretch. Second, on the economy, leaders also showed, I would say, a tremendous amount of solidarity. The G7 agreed to provide policy support to our economies for as long as necessary, both to recover from the pandemic and to rebuild our capacity for inclusive and sustained growth. That may not sound like a big deal, but it's actually a large mindset shift from previous recoveries when support was withdrawn too early and left scar tissue in labor markets and also in our economy's productive capacity. So just staying with the economy, the G7 also reached an historic agreement to end the race to the bottom on corporate taxation with a global minimum corporate tax rate. And the point of doing that is so each country can have more resources to invest in infrastructure and R&D, in the skills of our labor force, and more generally in our domestic renewal. Now, with regard to the developing world, where the recovery has been much more uneven and tragically slow, there were also a number of concrete actions. Leaders set a global ambition to repurpose $100 billion in IMF resources to the countries where the pandemic response needs are the greatest and where the economic recovery has been slowest. And then, the G7 also launched a new partnership that we're calling Build Back Better for the World, or B3W. And here our goal is to mobilize hundreds of billions of dollars to meet infrastructure needs in the developing world, with a specific focus on climate, health, digital technology, and gender equality. Point being, the Belt and Road Initiative should not be the only game in town, and we're prepared to offer a positive alternative that's more transparent, that raises up labor and environmental standards, and offers more sustainable financing, including equity investments where debt burdens are already too high. And lastly, we agreed to come together to update the rules of the road in the global economy. And by that, I mean trade, technology standards, supply chain resilience, data flows, in a way that reflects our shared commitments to fair competition and transparency and market principles. And look, this was not just an agreement in the abstract. 2 days after the G7 summit in Brussels, and Amanda may want to comment on this as well, we announced an end to the 16-year dispute between Boeing and Airbus. And the reason we had a breakthrough is because we made a shared commitment with the EU and the UK to compete on a level playing field and to jointly confront the economic practices from China, subsidies, technology theft, other distortions that have been undermining fair competition. And then in that same spirit, we also formed a Trade and Technology Council with the EU, just to raise the ambition of our economic cooperation and to take a collective stand against non-market practices. So look, first and foremost, this G7 was about showing self-confidence in who we are and what we can do. That's not to say that each country doesn't have work to do internally to heal our divisions, to deal with our disparities, and to convince more people that the system can work for them. We all have work to do and we know it. But the point is, let's not lose sight of our competitive advantages that flow from our shared values, freedom, opportunity, rule of law, the dignity of all people. This is the model that's produced the world's leading universities, a culture of innovation and entrepreneurship, the ability to attract ideas and talent and goodwill across the world, and the strongest alliances and partnerships that we have anywhere. So that was what we came to do. And the last point I'll make is that besides being clear on what we're for and mobilizing action from a position of strength, the G7 was also a moment that required us to be clear, and I would say emphatic, about what we won't tolerate. And here, I think Laura probably has more to say, but it was really important for us at the G7 to stand up for our shared values and speak with one collective voice on human rights abuses in Xinjiang, and to make a pledge to eradicate from our global supply chains all products that use forced labor. We also committed this year to end all G7 financing of overseas coal power projects, which many of you may know, that's the single largest contributor to global temperature rises. And then we also took a stand and recognized that corruption and ransomware are escalating cross-border national security threats that we have to confront together. So, if you take it all together, let me just leave you with what I think the G7 was all about. And at the most fundamental level, it was about taking our values seriously. Most importantly, in terms of what we're for, and here, as I just mentioned, we made real progress on an affirmative agenda, but also to uphold the rules-based system that forges the G7 partnership and benefits everyone in the world. And when that system is challenged, whether it's China or any other country, we'll stand up and defend it without apology. And I think I should just leave it there.
Great, thank you very much, Dilip. We'll turn things over now to Amanda Sloat. Please go ahead.
I thank you very much to Dan and to Abe for the invitation to speak, and to everybody who is tuning in today. It was wonderful to see the president's first overseas trip to Europe, and I think really no surprise on that, because the United States has no greater partners than our European friends and allies. And I think, as Dilip said, when you look across the world at the whole set of issues, both on global challenges and also on functional challenges, there also is no one better for us to cooperate with than with the Europeans. I think a number of the themes that Dilip laid out as top lines for the G7 were things that we saw continue across the rest of the president's trip in Europe, in terms of rallying like-minded democracies to take action on China, on cyber, on climate, on COVID. And all of this was driven by a shared commitment to democratic values and a shared commitment to writing the rules of the road together. The president, of course, started his trip in Cornwall, and in advance of the G7 meetings, he had a bilateral meeting with Boris Johnson, reaffirming the strong special relationship between our two countries. Coming out of that, the two leaders released an updated version of the Atlantic Charter. This was a document that was signed 80 years ago between Churchill and Roosevelt, and it was a good opportunity for us to be able to refresh that, to modernize it for the current age, to recommit ourselves to the values and challenges that we are currently facing. And then a very robust set of discussions between the two leaders about how best to confront those challenges. Following the G7 meeting, and of course a very good visit with the Queen at Windsor Palace, the president went to Brussels for a series of summits and more bilateral engagements with European leaders. The hallmark of this, of course, was the NATO summit, the first time that NATO had had a full summit since 2018, the first communique that came out since 2018, and a number of things to highlight from that I think were particularly striking. The president, first of all, was very clear in reaffirming America's commitment to NATO, and particularly America's commitment to Article 5 and to its security guarantees. China was a key deliverable coming out of NATO. It was the first time that a NATO summit communique has referenced China, and the summit also recommitted to producing a new strategic concept, which will be developed over the next year and then launched at the NATO summit next year. Part of that will include a refreshed look at China, which did not feature in the 2010 strategic concept, as well as an updated look at Russia, which was referred to as a partner in the 2010 strategic concept. On the topic of Russia, the president made very clear his continued commitment to NATO's core objective of deterrence and defense, and made that very clear to allies, particularly in the context of his meeting later that week with President Putin. The president had the opportunity to engage on the margins of the meeting with a number of our Eastern flank allies. He had a good conversation with the three Baltic leaders, having the opportunity to talk about China and Russia, as well as cyber cooperation, Belarus, and the collective response by the United States and Europe that was actually rolled out this past Monday, along with Canada and the UK, imposing costs on the regime in Belarus following the incident with the Ryanair flight and the politically motivated arrest of a journalist at the end of May. The president also had a good opportunity to engage on the margins with the leader of Poland, Slovakia, and a number of other allies, building on the conversation that he had several weeks ago with the Bucharest Nine, really wanting to solidify American support for our Eastern flank allies in advance of this summit. Also coming out of the summit was a very strong focus on cybersecurity. Certainly, we here in the United States have seen increasing attacks on cyber infrastructure with Colonial Pipeline and others, similar attacks that we have seen in Europe. And the leaders coming out of the NATO summit endorsed for the first time in 7 years NATO's cyber defense policy to really ensure that NATO as an institution and as an alliance is developing the resilience that is necessary to be able to deal with these threats. NATO also took seriously the climate crisis, endorsing for the first time a climate security action plan and setting an ambition for NATO to take very seriously and to find ways of dealing with the security implications of climate change. So also on the margins of the NATO meeting, the president had the opportunity to meet in person with President Erdogan of Turkey. It was a good opportunity for the two of them to engage directly with a particular focus on Afghanistan and Turkey's commitment to continue to provide security at the airport following the drawdown of the NATO mission there. And second, for the two leaders to be able to discuss the S-400s, Turkey's purchase of Russian military equipment, and for the president to reaffirm the United States' longstanding position on that. The following day, the president had the opportunity to engage with our Belgian hosts, meeting with the Belgian King, Prime Minister, and Foreign Minister, and then went on to hold a summit with EU leaders, which I believe was the first summit since 2014, the first leaders meeting since a number of years ago. And as Dilip said, really was an opportunity to raise the level of ambition in the transatlantic relationship, in our relationship with the European Union. Very strong commitment in the joint statement, which I would encourage people to take a look at if you haven't already, because I think it sets out a really good roadmap of joint actions that we plan to build on over the next year, with very strong commitments to cooperate on climate, to continue working together on fighting the COVID pandemic. We launched an experts working group with the EU to deal with travel restrictions, to find a science-based way to be able to reopen travel between our countries. As Dilip said, the centerpiece of all of this was launching the Trade and Technology Council. This was a proposal that the European Commission had in their document that was published in December, setting out a roadmap for the new administration. And so it was a real pleasure to be able to launch that less than 6 months into the new administration. And I think it's going to provide an excellent framework for us to be able to set the rules of the road together on a large number of technology issues, and to continue finding ways to strengthen and deepen our bilateral trade relationship. As Dilip said, it was a highlight of the summit to be able to make progress after over 16 years on the Airbus-Boeing dispute, to bring some closure there. Trade Representative Tai continued on to London at the end of the week, was able to make similar progress there. And there's continued discussion that we are having with the European Union to try and address the 232 steel and aluminum tariffs as well. Finally, the joint statement sets out a lot of areas for joint cooperation on foreign policy, including Belarus, as I mentioned on Monday. I'm realizing as I'm going on, the president also did good diplomacy on the margins of the G7 in terms of having a meeting with French President Macron, with the Italian leader Draghi. Finally, he went on to Switzerland, and before he saw Putin, was able to meet with the Swiss president and foreign minister as well. So we'll wrap up there, but really I think a great opportunity for the president to be able to engage both multilaterally with NATO and with the European Union, and also to be able to do a lot of direct diplomacy with leaders literally from east to west across the continent on the margins of these various summits.
Great. Thank you. Thank you very much, Amanda. Laura, please.
Great. Well, thanks again to you, Abe, to Dan, to all your colleagues. And I want to build on what Dilip and Amanda have already talked about in terms of the significant steps that we saw related to China throughout the trip, and just kind of zoom out for a moment to talk about how these advances actually fit into the broader China strategy that the Biden administration is executing upon. A key pillar of our approach to China is actually working with allies and partners, is revitalizing U.S. global leadership, restoring our alliances and partnerships, and renewing our work in international institutions. We've been doing that from the beginning of the administration. The president, of course, had an early virtual summit with the Quad leaders. He then has had in-person summits with our allies from Japan and Korea, and then has gone on to have the suite of meetings that we just discussed in detail in Europe. And throughout each of these, the president has been making very deliberate and significant progress in forging convergence with our allies and partners on China and on our approach. I think what we are seeing is a real convergence across several major lines of effort that are really important for this administration. Number one, of course, is the values piece. And Dilip talked about this, and I just want to spend a minute specifically, not just on Xinjiang generally. Of course, you know, we did see earlier this year the coordinated sanctions that the U.S., EU, Canada, and UK took together, imposing sanctions on certain companies involved in Xinjiang. But we also made more tangible progress on that, specifically focused on forced labor, as Dilip mentioned, through the G7. the United States today has made further good on our own commitment under that G7 statement by taking a suite of actions around eliminating steps to eliminate forced labor, goods from forced labor in our supply chains. And we'll be working with our allies and partners to continue to make good on that. But we also have seen language around Hong Kong in a number of these statements. We've been building to figure out ways that we can work together to set the standards and rules through the Trade and Tech Council, which will be an important vector for this going forward. But importantly, in each of these moments and throughout the trip, as Dilip said, we are working to show that it is about democracies coming together on what we are for, providing an affirmative vision that stands in contrast to what China is offering. And this trip was a major step in advancing all of those priorities. We have a lot of work to do going ahead, but I think across the major lines of effort, whether it's working to deal with China's non-market economic practices, whether it's dealing with forced labor, whether it's pursuing this affirmative Build Back Better world, whether it's coordinating on supply chain resilience, these are all major priority lines of effort for the president and ones where we're seeing significant progress in working with our allies and partners. I think what's really important for me is to point out that this is a distinguishing feature of our China policy. When we came in, there were a lot of things for us to build upon in terms of what the previous administration was doing with respect to China. But what we didn't have was the multilateral piece. And we have spent a significant amount of time and effort, and the president has personally, over the past few months, to really multilateralize our approach to China, whether it is countering their worst abuses in the human rights space, whether it's countering their economic practices, whether it's building an affirmative vision, whether it's putting forward a values-based vision for the world that shows that democracies can deliver. This is a really key part of our approach to China. And we're really pleased to see so much convergence happening with our allies and partners and so much to build on going forward. So I'll stop there.
Great, thank you all very much. We'll turn into the brief discussion phase. Before we do, I'll remind the audience that they can submit questions via email by emailing gep@wilsoncenter.org or over Twitter using the handle @WilsonCenterGEP. First will be a 5-minute discussion between Dilip Singh and my deputy, the Deputy Director of the Asia Program for Geoeconomics and Senior Associate for Northeast Asia, Shihoko Goto. Go ahead, Shihoko.
Great, thank you. And thank you, Dilip, for joining us today. I wanted to follow up on your comment about the G7 really showcasing solidarity amongst US allies. One of the biggest strengths of the United States, of course, is its strength in the number of allies that it has, especially in comparison to China. And that's certainly true on the security front. But what about when it comes to economic partnerships? Yes, we've had this breakthrough in agreement about the global minimum corporate tax rate that the Treasury was really instrumental in pushing, and there's growing expectation for the G20 to endorse at least the principle, if not the exact rate of 15% of the tax rate. But at the same time, there's a lot of shaken confidence worldwide about US economic commitment more broadly. And at the G7, we've seen this reaffirmation of faith in open, fair trade. And it's not really clear how that shared perception of economic challenges can lead to future collaborative action, especially when Washington is on the sidelines of deepening trade relations within Asia and between Asia and Europe without the United States. And they're moving along quite steadily without Washington. So how does the United States reconcile beefing up its domestic competitiveness on the one hand and in leading international economic cooperation with its hands really tied when it comes to dealing with systemic trade challenges?
What I started out saying is that when the president came into office, you're right that he said, look, I have a commitment that I made on the campaign to first restore US domestic strength. And the first step in doing so was to beat back the pandemic. And he made that a wartime whole of government effort. And since he took office, we've seen results. Cases are down over 90%. Deaths from COVID are down over 85%. Millions of people are going back to their lives. And it's given us a chance to help the rest of the world with the largest donation of vaccines in history, 500 million vaccines that we announced at the G7. Now, closely related to beating back the pandemic was, really restoring economic strength, and beating back the pandemic was a prerequisite for that. But, he took a deliberate approach to a fiscal strategy that was unflinching and big, so it wasn't just about building a bridge to the other side of the pandemic shock. It's also been about making generational investments in R&D and infrastructure and our labor force, so that we have the innovation and dynamism and competitiveness on the world stage. Now, what I was coming to, I think this is where it may have come back online in terms of my sound, is none of that is incompatible with a multilateral global leadership role for the US. In fact, the OECD projects that US growth this year is going to add a percentage point to global GDP growth. And that's coming after a year in which global GDP contracted 3.5%. It's the worst peacetime recession since the Great Depression. So it goes well beyond that. At the G7, we accomplished something I think pretty important, which is we got agreement on all countries sustaining their fiscal support for as long as needed to ensure an inclusive and a sustained recovery. We haven't always had that kind of synchronized macroeconomic policy among the G7. I don't think we can overstate the importance of this tax agreement that we're marching towards. It's 140 countries. It is going to provide every country more resources to invest in their infrastructure, their R&D, their labor force, their productive capacity. And that's critically important. What it also does in terms of this tax agreement is it rebalances the burden between labor and capital. If you look at the share of tax revenues in the US that have been raised from labor income, it's gone up from 50% in 1950 to over 80% recently. And the corporate tax burden has fallen from 30% of the total to under 10%. This is a problem across the world, and this is a step towards a healthier balance. I would also say, beyond the macro policies and the tax policies I mentioned, we made, I think, pretty serious progress in the G7 and in Brussels in, as Amanda put it, updating the rules of the road. There's the president talks about this tremendous inflection point that's taking place right now in terms of the impact of emerging technologies and data flows and changes to our supply chains. And we need new rules, just like we did after World War II. We have to update them again. And we need to update them in a way that provides for a level playing field. And that's the work that we have begun. And we made, I think, very tangible progress with Europe and our key partners in the G7 in terms of creating a united front. And so it goes well beyond trade. It relates to tax, to currency, to technology, to supply chains, to how climate impacts our economic relationships. It's a much broader conception of an economic partnership. And, and this goes to what Laura was describing. It goes to confronting the really predatory and unfair practices that we all have suffered from when it relates to China. And we want to take a united front in calling out those practices. And let's be really clear about what they are. There are major subsidies that distort competition in a number of strategic industries. Technology theft has sapped a lot of the innovative products and ingenuity out of the US and also Europe and many of our allies. There's been discriminatory regulatory treatment that's been placed upon our companies. And it's not just the US, it is a G7 and arguably most of the G20. We're all facing this problem. We're trying to confront it together. I think that's collaboration, that's partnership. And that's what we ended up doing in Cornwall and in Brussels and beyond.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dilip. We'll turn now to Amanda Sloat and my colleague from the Wilson Center, the director of the Global Europe Program, Dan Hamilton.
Thanks, Abe. Amanda, thanks so much for that overview of the amazing series of summits, if you think about it, that the president had, not only the multilateral ones, but all the bilateral ones that you mentioned. And I don't envy you having to make sure all of those went well, hour by hour. So, you know, it struck me what to talk to you about, and some questions that I've been fielding since then about that come from media or others, and I thought maybe I'd get your sense of this. One is on the NATO summit. You mentioned a number of interesting areas. NATO is actually, you know, striking out now on a new kind of path on climate change. I've been stressing the resilience piece of the NATO efforts, which I think is a really quite important and broad effort. There was an announcement of a NATO accelerator, you know, sort of a emerging technology, just a startup kind of thing with a NATO innovation fund. There's discussion of more common funding for NATO. All of that leads to kind of the question about resources and burden sharing, which, you know, has been a consistent theme across many presidents of Europeans, you know, helping to share the burden of NATO costs. So with all of those new initiatives, I wonder, you know, how much are you and the president, you know, happy with where our allies are in terms of helping to share the burdens of all of those initiatives going forward, because that seems to be a consistent issue for the people. The second question I had was on U.S. EU. We seem to, again, sort of turn the page here, but on the real, you know, dynamic trade, we're not quite there, it seems. The Airbus Boeing, it's a 5-year pause, and the tariffs are still there. Promises to try to get rid of them maybe by the year, but they're not gone now. And many people ask me, why didn't they just, you know, get rid of them now if they want to really turn the page? Seems to me both of those issues still have to do with China, because the Airbus Boeing is to, you know, let's not fight each other because of China subsidizing its own airline industry. And secondly, on the tariffs, the overcapacity in steel is the real problem. And how do we deal with that? Just by lifting our own tariffs might not deal with that. Last question is just a little one that I noticed in the communique with U.S. EU, a statement essentially saying the European Union is going to help co-sponsor or help the president's idea of a summit for democracy. And I just wonder, is that something new that really now the EU is joining in on that at the, you know, co-sponsoring it, or is that an overreading of maybe what was said?
Well, thank you very much, Dan. And like you said, it was a very robust week of diplomacy. It really felt like doing about a year's worth of diplomacy in a week. I think after having been grounded for the last year because of COVID, it was a really great opportunity for the president to get back on the ground and frankly do what he loves best, which is engaging in very direct personal relationships with leaders and his counterparts. If I take your questions in reverse order on the Democracy Summit, I think it's just a general statement of support by the European Union for the president's plan for the Democracy Summit. Our colleagues here at the National Security Council are busy working through a lot of the logistics and the plans for that, so nothing specific to read out at this point. But it's certainly fair to say that we've received a huge degree of enthusiasm across the European Union from our partners there, and a very strong desire to engage and participate. And the message of democracy was certainly one that the president conveyed both at NATO and at the European Union, recognizing the challenges that we have to confront here at home, wanting to challenge partners to do the necessary to improve democracy in their homes, and then to take the fight much more globally, as we have been talking about, in terms of this very existential challenge that the president sees right now between the democratic and authoritarian systems. On the question of economics, Dileep may have more that he wants to chime in on that piece with Airbus Boeing and with the 232s. Certainly the impetus really for the Trade and Technology Council is to give both of our sides a vehicle to be able to really engage in targeted conversations on a number of these fronts. As you say, a number of these are longstanding irritants, the Airbus Boeing one going on for over 16 years. I think the fact that we were able to make such progress on the Airbus Boeing tariffs really was something that was significant. Similarly, with the 232s, the EU not going forward with retaliatory tariffs at the beginning of June, really providing an opportunity for us to engage in a dialogue to address what the real threat is on steel and aluminum, which is global overproduction by China and others. And so I think very much as you're saying, to the extent to which we can clear out some of the underbrush in our own relationship, it's really going to set the stage for us to be able to work together in a much more targeted way on some of these global challenges and setting some of these rules of the road together. On the NATO communique, thank you for highlighting some of those additional things. I think it was over 70 paragraphs long and really set out a very robust agenda. So certainly we have our work cut out for us, both at NATO and the EU, to now implement all of these dialogues and new initiatives that we have created, although it's a very exciting opportunity, I think, to work across a number of fronts. Resources are, of course, as you say, going to remain a very important part of that. And we were very pleased to get a commitment in the communique to ensure that NATO is properly resourced, and that included a commitment to increasing common funding. And the expectation is that NATO as an organization is going to continue taking that forward over the next year, and to continue working with allies to ensure that NATO does have those resources. Defense spending has gone up by allies consistently over the last 7 years since the 2014 pledge during the Obama-Biden administration on the 2% defense spending commitment. The president, in his remarks at NATO, continued to reaffirm American support for allies to meet their defense spending targets. And he also laid out that in addition to cash, there is an important need to focus on contributions and capabilities as well. Secretary Blinken delivered a major speech on alliances when he was in Brussels in March on the margins of the foreign ministerial meeting, and similarly made a very strong pitch for continued defense spending, including this broader context of contributions and capabilities as part of that.
Great, thank you to you both. Now we'll turn to Laura Rosenberger and Robert Daly, who's director of the Kissinger Institute on China and the United States at the Wilson Center.
Thanks, Abe, and thanks, Laura, and congratulations on what really was, I think, an extremely encouraging trip. I have, and you can answer or ignore them as you see fit. One, after the meeting, has shown increased interest in dialogue with China from defense and through other channels at ever higher levels. If we are going to enter into a phase of dialogue and somewhat greater engagement, it helps to have an ambassador on the ground in Beijing. Can you tell us anything about when we might expect a nomination or to have somebody in place? That's one. On this theme of convergence, it seems to me that a growing number of European countries have the same set of worries and concerns about China that we do, thanks in part to the work of this administration. They have more or less the same concerns, minus our desire to maintain preeminence, minus some of our interests in the Indo-Pacific and in Europe, plus an interest in connectivity with China because of proximity. Background, it seems that convergence is not complete. We have seen since President Biden's trip, German candidates who may replace Merkel, speaking of going a little bit more softly on China, relying more on quiet diplomacy. We've seen, if Chinese reports are to be believed, the Italian foreign minister sort of recommitting to the Belt and Road Initiative in a talk with Wang Yi. The Italian readout didn't say that. We've seen Hungary, Greece moving to block criticisms of human rights. So could you tell us where do you think we are right now? What do you see as the biggest obstacles to continued convergence? And how are you measuring that? And then just lastly, you spoke of an affirmative vision. Are there any circumstances under which that could include China? Are there any conditions under which the Biden administration might actually welcome an enhanced Chinese role in rulemaking? Growing economy and military and massive population, do we foresee them outside of a growing circle of convergence, or are there any times that they That's a lot to throw on your plate. Just take or leave what you like.
No, thanks so much, Robert, and thanks for the good questions. Your audio, or at least on our end, it was breaking up just a tiny bit, but I think I got enough of what you put down, and I'll just pretend that the parts I don't want to answer you cut out in the middle. So yeah, right. Thank you for the audio help with that. No, they're great questions. So I'll just take them in order. First, I unfortunately can't make news here for you on the topic of an ambassador to China. Don't have anything to share there. But certainly I would say, look, I know there's been some swirl of press. Some of it has been subsequently corrected when there were some inaccurate reports that are out there. What I would say, though, on the topic of dialogue is we've been really clear from the beginning. Then when it comes to China, our lines of communication are open. We believe it's really important that we directly, candidly are able to raise our concerns and have very purposeful dialogue that is practical, that is results-oriented, and frankly, that is done from a position of strength, right? That is built on a foundation of reinvesting in ourselves at home and our sources of strength, and that is importantly built on a foundation of renewed global alliances and partnerships. And again, the conversations that Amanda and Dilip talked about with our European allies are a critical foundation that help build that strength. I mean, they're one of the greatest sources of our strength. So we certainly, of course, have open lines of communication with China, but I think when we think about the question of dialogue and how it fits in our approach, we need to be able to do many things with China at once. I don't think this is about phases in one way or another. This is about being able to act to protect our interests and values and those of our allies and partners at the same time that we compete stiffly with China, to use the president's words, in a very deliberate fashion. At the same time that we are countering some of their worst abuses, at the same time that we are working to cooperate with them when it is in our interest to do so, and at the same time that we engage from that position of strength. We have to be able to do all those things at once. We've been doing that from the beginning. That was the backdrop to Anchorage. That was the backdrop to the president's call with Xi Jinping, and certainly would be the backdrop to any future engagement that we would have with China. But again, the allies and partners piece as a foundation for that, building on that strength is really critical for us. On your second question on convergence, look, the reality is that we're never going to have 100% convergence with any of our allies on anything. I mean, we have differences with even our closest of friends. That is natural. The key for me is maximizing our alignments, and where we have divergence, understanding it and managing it so that we can't be divided from one another. And I think that's what we're looking for. And that's where we're seeing progress as we move forward. There's no question that we will continue to have different perspectives on certain things. In some places, we will have different interests. It's also an area where, I would note one of the things you said where we don't still have alignment, or where you sort of called out as a difference, is interest in the Indo-Pacific. And I would suggest that maybe there is a greater shift underway than your characterization might have indicated. We saw a reference to the Indo-Pacific in some of the conversations and statements coming out of the summit. A number of European capitals, as well as the EU, have been working on their own Indo-Pacific strategies. We are seeing a much more robust engagement from a number of particularly maritime powers in the Indo-Pacific. And so I do think that there is movement, may not be convergence, but certainly I think there is movement there. And I think that, again, we just build on that. And again, when there are differences, we recognize that and we figure out how we manage them. On the third piece, on the affirmative vision, look, I think the reality is that the president's been quite clear. He does believe that there is a competition between which system can deliver best for their own people and for the world, between democracies and autocracies. But this is as much, and again, this is why I put it in the affirmative vision piece, this is as much about showing that democracies deliver, that they can write the rules of the road in the way that provides the best opportunities for the world's people, including our own people at home. And so, look, there will be areas where we can and hopefully will be able to cooperate with China. But I think that the key for us is here, what is the kind of behavior we're seeking? What are the rules that we're following? And how do we understand them being set? I won't go down the path of specifics of what we're seeing in Hong Kong over the past few days and the just, real erosion of significant freedom, particularly in the media space. And I would note again on that we have seen statements not just from the president, but from a number of European allies and other capitals around the world expressing real outrage about that. And so I do think, again, that there is a sense here that the model that China is putting forward is one that really is, causes deep concern for the United States and for our European allies.
Great, thanks to all of you. We have a little bit over 10 minutes to go through Q&As. We have a lot of questions that came in. I want to make sure that we can get to as many as possible. So we're going to group them together, and we'll let you run through them, and I'll ask our guests if they could keep their answers short and sweet if possible. So I'll also take the prerogative as moderator to ask a question from myself and insert that into our first round here. So, and each of these questions seems to apply well to each of our guest speakers. So first, my question for Dilip specifically is really building on something that Laura said, greater interest in Europe in the Indo-Pacific. As the Asia director at Wilson, I was especially pleased to see that representatives from Australia, India, and the ROK were invited to join the G7. And there was some very helpful statements coming out of that meeting about the importance of the Indo-Pacific. I wanted to ask you if you could speak a bit about the role of Asia's major economies that aren't necessarily reflected in the G7, and how you expect European, as the United States, European major economies and Asia's major economies to work together on these shared issues, maybe as an extension of the G7. Not expecting much institutionalization, but I'm wondering if you could just talk a bit about the role that these other major economies could play in advancing these interests as well. For Amanda, we have a question from Karen Shui, who's the DC director of the Estonian American National Council, who wanted to ask Amanda, when President Biden met with Baltic leaders on the 14th, he reportedly told them that he would bring up Baltic issues during his June 16th meeting with Russian President Putin. She wanted to know if that actually happened, if so, what was discussed, and how did Putin respond? And then for Laura, from Owen Churchill from the South China Morning Post, you addressed this a bit, but thought you could address it maybe in a bit more detail. Asking what challenges remain in the administration's efforts to work with European allies on China. If you could talk a bit about areas of convergence, areas of divergence, and where you think the main priorities would be to better align the United States and our European allies when it comes to China. So that's our first round. Dilip, if you want to jump in first.
Yeah, sure, Abe. So I'll answer your question with an example. You asked, how are the major economies of Asia and Europe coming together with us, even beyond the G7? And the example I would point to is infrastructure needs in the developing world. The problem here is very large. The World Bank estimates that there are 40 trillion plus in cumulative infrastructure needs through 2035. China's offered a solution, the Belt Road Initiative. It didn't start out as a grand strategy or a major centerpiece of their foreign policy, but it evolved into that. We don't know the exact size, of course, because there's no transparency when it comes to the Belt Road Initiative, but suffice it to say it's big and it's global, and it's increasingly in parts of the world, you alluded to Italy, that are either where our close allies are or even where we are in the Western Hemisphere. So what we've done at the G7, and this will go beyond the G7, is we've decided to offer a positive alternative. The Belt Road Initiative does not have transparency. It's very difficult to know what the financing terms are. Even some of the people whose governments have signed up for Belt Road projects don't know what the terms are. Often there are serious environmental consequences of these projects. Take the hydropower dam in Ecuador. There have been 2 oil spills out of the reservoir that was built and caused serious erosion. Many countries have fallen into financial distress and have had to pledge mineral reserves or oil production in exchange for debt. So we're going to be transparent. We're going to be high standards in terms of labor and environmental standards. And we're going to provide sustainable financing, not just debt, because a lot of countries have too much of it, also equity. And if we provide equity, the private sector could be mobilized to invest with us. So we're not going to try to compete dollar for dollar with the Belt Road Initiative. We're going to compete with a higher quality. And it can be a partnership that goes well beyond the G7. That's our ambition, is to take this springboard, take it to the G20, put down some numbers by the time we get together in October, and then achieve credible scale. I'll stop there because I know we're short on time.
I will thank you. I can be very short in my response. I was not in President Biden's meeting with President Putin, and unfortunately don't have a full readout of everything that was discussed. But certainly the president has made very clear, both in his meeting with the three Baltic leaders, as well as in his engagement with the Bucharest 9 allies in advance of the summit, of his very strong commitment to the security of our NATO allies and to the significance that he places on deterrence and defense, along with dialogue.
And I'll come in here with the question of convergence and remaining challenges and areas of divergence. I'll start off by saying I'm a glass half full person, so I tend to really focus on the upside here. But I'm happy to elaborate a little bit further from my comments with Robert. I think one of the most significant areas of convergence that we have seen, particularly between the U.S. and our European allies, is around values. I think that this is an incredibly important area where obviously it's an underpinning of our transatlantic alliance. And it's also, I think, deeply important for many Europeans. And the values placed on human rights and universal freedoms is something that I think is really central to European identity. And it's an area where, again, this president also feels that very deeply. He has had extensive conversations with our allies in Europe, frankly, also directly with Xi Jinping, about the importance that he places on upholding universal values. And I think that has been part of the underpinning of the sort of accelerated convergence that I would say we've seen, is the ability to really align between Washington and Europe on that agenda. And obviously, there's a whole host of issues that come alongside. To me, that's not just Xinjiang, Hong Kong, forced labor. I think that questions of economic coercion relates to abiding by rules of the road. It relates to setting the standards and norms for the technologies of the future. And I think we could continue down a list of actions and behaviors where the U.S. and Europe are finding increasing alignment because of values. I think that, others, Robert mentioned earlier, of course, sort of different interests, certainly the deep economic ties that Europe has with China. So too, by the way, does the United States. And so I think sometimes we may lose that perspective a bit, but I think that it is important for us to understand ways that we can better support one another in ways that Dilip talked about and that Amanda alluded to in terms of resolving some of the areas where we've maybe been sort of opposed to one another instead of actually supporting one another. And I think there's a lot more that we can do in that space, frankly, on both sides of the Atlantic, to make sure that we are working to address any differences there and actually allow us to stand together against the coercive and otherwise problematic behaviors that we see from Beijing on the economic front. But the reality is that I am, as I said, glass half full. And frankly, I think, I don't think we should underestimate the importance of having the substantial China discussion in the NATO summit statement. I think if you had asked me a year ago, I would have told you that an area of divergence was lack of real recognition in Europe that China posed a direct security challenge. And I think that the NATO summit statement is a pretty clear indication that is not the case anymore. And so again, really see increasing movement there. we still need to define out in a lot of areas what sort of the practical work is that will happen on some of those pieces. But I'm personally quite encouraged, and frankly, given the importance of our European allies and how much we have done together with purpose across the Atlantic over the past decades, as we look to the challenges of the future, it's just unbelievably important that we are able to stand alongside with one another. We will be much more effective acting on these challenges together in a united front, as Dilip suggested, than if we were just doing this unilaterally.
Well, thanks to you all. I think we're just about out of time. I think that going into the Biden administration, the general sense in Washington was that our allies and partners were going to be a bit difficult to engage at first, a bit skeptical about American commitments, and skeptical about our ability to work with them. And I think what we found over the last 6 months, in Asia as well as in Europe, is that these relationships were more resilient and robust than we expected, and that their view of the United States is more robust than we expected. And I think we've made some good progress already, but clearly there's a lot more work to do. And personally speaking, I'm glad that the three of you are there doing the work. So Dilip Singh, Amanda Sloat, Laura Rosenberger, thank you all very much for joining us. Our work with allies and partners is something that the Wilson Center intends to continue to focus on in the next few years, and we hope to continue to engage with you on this both privately and publicly. And so to bring us home, I'm going to turn things over to my colleague, Dan Hamilton.
Thanks, Abe. Thanks for moderating so well. And thanks to the NSC colleagues. Great session. This will be on YouTube, and people can view it. I want to thank also the Wilson Center team. First of all, the colleagues here on the screen with us, but also my colleagues, Teresa Ader and Jason Moyer, and our B team that makes this all work. So thank you all. Hope to stay in touch with everyone, and we appreciate your time. Thank you again, and take care.
Thank you.